Imagine stepping into a hall where the air itself feels heavy with secrets. The torches flicker against stone walls, shadows curl along the edges of the chamber, and every glance, every whisper carries the weight of life or death. This is Henry VIII's court, a place where love was never simply love, but a weapon, a bargain, a dangerous game. Here, a smile could crown you queen. A careless word could condemn you to the scaffold. Behind the velvet curtains of the Tudor palaces, passion burned as hot as ambition, and betrayal struck with the swiftness of a blade. Picture it, silk gowns sweeping across rush-strewn floors, the metallic tang of candle smoke in the air, courtiers bowing low while their eyes betray hungers they dare not speak aloud. Imagine yourself standing there, your breath caught, your fate teetering on the edge of a monarch's desire. This was a world where kings broke kingdoms for love, where queens bled for sons never born, where a single rumor could topple the most powerful family in England. Love, blood, and shadows, that was the currency of the Tudor court. And so, with the echo of footsteps through Hampton Court's galleries, let us begin. Would you like me to move straight into Catherine of Aragon's story, flowing from this hook into her arrival as a young bride of destiny? The palace corridors whisper with draughts of cool air, carrying the faint scent of beeswax and wine. Beyond those carved oak doors, you hear laughter, bright, elegant, layered with both charm and calculation. It is the laughter of courtiers, eager to be seen, eager to be heard, each one hoping to catch the eye of the most dangerous man in Europe, Henry Tudor, King of England, defender of the faith. But long before Henry's voice echoed through these chambers, long before his hunger for glory and sons reshaped England forever, another figure arrived to this island kingdom, bearing with her a crown of destiny and a heart tempered by steel. She was a girl of Spain, raised beneath the blazing Castilian sun, taught from infancy that queens were not made for comfort but for sacrifice. Catherine of Aragon. Can you picture her, stepping off the ship in 1501? The wind tangling her auburn hair, the hem of her gown heavy with sea salt? She was only 16, her face pale from the voyage, but her presence carried the pride of two thrones. Daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, the monarchs who had united Spain, expelled the Moors, and financed Columbus's voyage into the unknown, Catherine was no mere princess. She was the embodiment of empire. England was colder, grayer than the Spain she had left behind. The sky sagged with mist, the air smelled of damp earth, and the English court eyed her with curiosity and calculation. Yet Catherine carried with her not only her mother's stern faith and her father's political cunning, but also the golden dowry that promised an alliance strong enough to bind England to Spain against France. For in those days, every marriage was a treaty written not in ink but in flesh. Her destiny, at first, was not Henry at all. It was his elder brother, Arthur, Prince of Wales. A boy barely older than she was, pale and serious, burdened by expectation. Their marriage was celebrated with pageantry, triumphal arches, banquets, masks, the whole kingdom watching this young couple as the embodiment of England's future. For one brief winter, they were husband and wife. And then, cruelly, fate turned. Arthur sickened in the damp Welsh air of Ludlow Castle. A fever gripped him, burning away all hope. Catherine, too, fell ill, but she survived. When the chill of April 1502 fell upon the castle, Arthur was dead, barely 15, his promise extinguished like a candle in a draught. Imagine Catherine in those moments, 16 years old, widowed, stranded in a foreign court. The dream of alliance hung by a thread, her future uncertain. She might have been sent back to Spain, discarded as a failed investment. Instead, she remained in England, waiting, watched, maneuvered over by kings and counselors. And it was during those years of limbo that Henry Tudor, the younger brother, red-haired, broad-shouldered, restless with ambition, began to rise. Henry VIII was not meant to be king. He had been the spare, the second son, destined for the church perhaps, or a life in the shadow of Arthur. But when death rewrote the script, Henry became heir. And with that shift, Catherine's fate turned once again. Years passed. She lived in relative obscurity, sometimes treated with honor, sometimes neglected. At times she was left nearly penniless, her household reduced to scraps, her letters to her father filled with quiet desperation. She endured loneliness, uncertainty, and the humiliation of being dangled like a political prize, waiting for a marriage that might never come. Yet she did not yield. She studied. She prayed. She held herself with dignity, refusing to be dismissed as a forgotten widow. And then, in 1509, the old king died. Henry VII, shrewd and cautious, gave way to his son, the young Henry VIII, 18 years old, vigorous, radiant, eager to carve his place in history. Within weeks of his coronation, he married Catherine. The wedding was not only a union of two people but of two nations, two destinies. London rang with bells, the streets spilled over with celebration, and the people cheered for their new queen, a queen who spoke with a Castilian lilt, who dressed in Spanish silks, who carried herself with both grace and quiet fire. At first, it seemed a love story. Henry adored her. He called her his true wife, his most beloved lady. He admired her piety, her learning, her beauty, though time would dim it, then cruelly turn it against her. Together, they represented the promise of a golden age. But beneath the gold and the promise lurked the shadow that would grow darker with each passing year, the need for an heir. A son. Catherine conceived many times. Imagine the hushed anticipation each time her belly swelled, the prayers whispered in chapel, the courtiers' watchful eyes calculating futures with every kick of the child inside her. And imagine, too, the crushing grief that followed, the stillbirths, the infants who lived only days, the miscarriages that left her body frail and her heart breaking. She gave Henry one child who survived, a daughter, Mary. A bright, solemn girl who would one day wear England's crown. But in those years, Mary was not enough. Not for Henry, not for the dynasty. A king needed a son, a living emblem of continuity. And Catherine, despite her devotion, despite her strength, seemed unable to give him one. Years stretched into decades. Catherine aged, her once vibrant hair threaded with gray, her body worn from pregnancies and loss. Henry, still vigorous, still restless, began to turn his eyes elsewhere. And that is where the story darkens, where the warmth of love gives way to the chill of ambition. But Catherine of Aragon, did not yield. When Henry grew distant, when whispers began about annulments and papal dispensations, when the king himself began to question whether their marriage had ever been lawful, Catherine stood unbroken. She insisted she was Henry's rightful wife, God's anointed queen. She declared that she had come to him as a virgin, that her first marriage to Arthur had never been consummated. Before cardinals and ambassadors, before the highest powers of church and crown, she held her ground with the dignity of a queen and the ferocity of a lioness. Do you see her, standing in Blackfriars Hall in 1529? The trial of her marriage underway, the fate of England trembling in the balance. Henry sits upon his throne, his new passion, and Boleyn, glittering among the courtiers. The air is stifling with expectation. And Catherine, in her gown of dark velvet, steps forward. She kneels before Henry, her voice steady, her Castilian accent sharp with emotion. "My lord, I am a stranger in your kingdom, without friend or counselor. I beg you to pity me, a poor woman desolate and alone. I have been your true wife for 20 years, and I call God to witness that I have been to you a faithful and humble wife. If there be any just cause by law why I should put away, here I am, ready to answer before all." Then she rises, turns, and walks out of the hall, refusing to return. That moment, defiance wrapped in grace, became legend. She would not yield her crown. She would not admit guilt. She would not go quietly. But Henry was already lost to her. His hunger for Anne Boleyn, his obsession with a son, his willingness to break from Rome itself to have his way, all of it left Catherine on the wrong side of history. She was cast aside, sent to smaller, lonelier residences. Forbidden from seeing her daughter Mary. Left to live her final years in sorrow, her body failing, her heart unbroken in its faith. She wrote to her nephew, the Emperor Charles V, begging for protection, but none came. She wrote to Henry, still calling him her husband, still praying for his soul. And when death came to her at Kimbolton Castle in 1536, she faced it as she had faced life, with dignity. She left behind a daughter who would one day reign, a memory of devotion unbent, and a legacy as the queen who refused to yield. As the cold January air carried her funeral procession through the English countryside, people whispered that the true Queen of England had died, not the woman glittering at Henry's side, but the one who had endured, fought, and never surrendered her crown. And so, in the shadows of her passing, another figure rises, her eyes bright with triumph and danger, her name soon to ignite a storm that will shatter church and kingdom alike. Anne Boleyn. The air in the chamber still lingers with Catherine's defiance, as though her voice, firm, steady, unbroken, clings to the tapestries and stone. Yet, in the same shadows where one queen falls, another rises. And this one is not a woman of resignation, nor of patience. She is fire, she is wit sharpened into steel, and her name, whispered in corridors and behind painted fans, is Anne Boleyn. You can almost hear her footsteps now, quick, light, confident, as she glides through the candlelit halls. Where Catherine carried with her the solemn dignity of Spain, and brings something altogether different, a spark of danger. She was not born to be queen, not raised from cradle to be the bride of a king. No, and was the daughter of a courtier, a girl shaped by exile, by French elegance, by the intoxicating perfume of Renaissance courts. Her story does not begin in England at all, but in the glittering salons of Burgundy and France, where she was sent as a lady-in-waiting. There she learned how to dance, how to speak, how to wield charm like a dagger. She learned the art of clothing, silks draped just so, colors chosen to dazzle. She learned that words could seduce, that glances could conquer, that a woman, even in a world ruled by men, could bend the air around her if she knew how to breathe properly into it. By the time Anne returned to England, she was no longer just Thomas Boleyn's daughter. She was a woman of presence, dark eyes alive with intelligence, her French accented English lilting with allure, her smile quick and knowing. She was not the most beautiful woman at court. Contemporaries whispered of her sallow complexion, her sharp features, but beauty alone was not her weapon. It was her magnetism, her wit, her refusal to bow to expectation. And when Henry VIII's eyes fell upon her, the game began. He had known the Boleyns before, indeed, and Sister Mary had already been his mistress, a passing fancy easily discarded. But Anne was not like Mary. When Henry sent her gifts, and returned them, when he made his intentions clear, she stepped back. She would not be his mistress, she declared. She would be his wife, or nothing at all. Imagine the audacity of it. To deny a king. To look into the eyes of Henry Tudor, a man accustomed to bending the world to his will, and say, no? Yet that refusal, that tantalizing impossibility, only ensnared him deeper. For Henry was not used to denial, and desire denied is desire inflamed. The court became a stage for their dance. Courtiers whispered, eyes followed, and behind the scenes letters were written, Henry's passionate, pleading letters to Anne. I have been more than a year struck by the dart of love, he confessed. He begged for her favor, swore fidelity, dreamed of her in his bed. Anne, ever cautious, ever calculating, replied with grace but not surrender. She gave him glimpses, promises, tokens, but never her body. And so the years unfolded. Henry's obsession with Anne grew, as Catherine aged and his hope for a male heir dwindled. In Anne, he saw not only passion but possibility. She was young, she was fertile, or so he believed, and she could give him the son Catherine had not. But there was a barrier, his marriage. A marriage the Pope refused to annul. It is here, in this crucible of desire and politics, that the story of Anne Boleyn becomes larger than herself. For it was not merely a love affair. It was the spark that shattered a church. Henry, driven by lust and desperation, broke with Rome. He rejected the authority of the Pope, declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, and dissolved centuries of religious tradition, all for Anne. Imagine the weight of it: monasteries crumbling, priests swearing new oaths, a nation torn in faith. And at the heart of it all, a woman who had dared to say no. When at last Catherine was cast aside, and Anne was crowned queen in 1533, the streets of London roared with celebration, and with muttered disapproval. Many still loved Catherine, saw Anne as the usurper, the concubine. But for that moment, Anne triumphed. She rode in procession through London, her gown glittering, her crown heavy, her dark eyes flashing with pride. She was not just a mistress now. She was Henry's lawful wife, Queen of England, and soon to be the mother of his heir. And yet, fate is cruel, and ambition more cruel still. For Anne's triumph contained the seeds of her tragedy. In September 1533, she gave birth. The air in the chamber thick with anticipation, Henry waiting, desperate, every courtier straining to hear the news. The child was born, and the midwife announced, a daughter. Elizabeth. A healthy child, yes. A gift, yes. But not the son Henry longed for. You can almost feel the silence that must have followed, the sinking disappointment, the forced smiles. Henry concealed it at first, celebrated Elizabeth as his heir. But in his heart, disappointment gnawed. And conceived again and again, but fate dealt her cruel hands, miscarriages, stillbirths. And with each loss, Henry's patience thinned, his affection cooled. The fiery passion that had fueled a reformation turned into restless irritation. Where once Anne's wit had delighted him, now it pricked like thorns. Where once her refusal had inflamed him, now her demands grated. And Anne, unlike Catherine, was not a woman of quiet submission. She argued. She scolded. She reminded Henry of his promises. She quarreled with his advisers, especially Thomas Cromwell, whose political machinations would one day destroy her. Picture the court at this time, a nest of intrigue, every smile a mask, every word a weapon. The courtiers who had once flocked to and now sensed danger and drifted away. Enemies whispered of her arrogance, her sharp tongue, her inability to give the king a son. And in the shadows, another woman waited, Jane Seymour, pale, demure, obedient. The antithesis of Anne. Henry's eyes began to wander again, and must have felt the walls closing in. She had risen higher than any could have imagined, but the higher the climb, the steeper the fall. Still, she did not yield. She wore yellow at Catherine's funeral, a gesture many saw as cruel, but perhaps she meant it as a symbol of triumph, or of hope renewed. She quarreled with Jane Seymour, snatching a locket from her neck when she found Henry's portrait inside. She clung to her crown with desperate brilliance, but the tide had already turned. Her enemies gathered. Cromwell, once her ally, turned against her. Whispers of adultery began to circulate, whispers that would soon become charges. But that belongs to another chamber, another shadowy corridor in this endless palace of fate. For now, we leave in triumphant yet trembling, crowned yet precarious, her dark eyes alight with both victory and foreboding. The woman who had captured a king's heart, and in doing so, torn England from Rome. The passion that shattered a church was hers. But passions that burn too fiercely leave only ashes. And in the ashes, the first sparks of her downfall begin to glow. The candles in the great hall gutter low, the wax dripping like tears onto the stone floor. The revelry of Anne's coronation is but a memory now, a ghost of trumpets and cheers that once echoed through London. What remains is silence, heavy, watchful, and tinged with suspicion. For in the gilded chambers of Henry VIII's court, triumph is never permanent, and passion can curdle into peril with terrifying speed. Anne Boleyn, who once dazzled with wit and laughter, now walks those same corridors with the weight of expectation pressing on her shoulders. She had promised England a son, had promised Henry the legacy of a dynasty secured in flesh and blood. Instead, in September of 1533, she delivered Elizabeth, a child of fire and brilliance to history, but in that moment, to Henry, a bitter disappointment wrapped in lace. Do you see it? The king pacing in his private chambers, his red gold beard bristling, his eyes clouded with doubt. He had torn his kingdom from Rome, risked eternal damnation, endured years of battle with popes and priests, all for Anne. And now, where was the reward? A daughter. Just a daughter. And tried again. Her body endured the ceaseless cycle of hope and heartbreak. In 1534 she conceived, and for a time the court hummed with anticipation. Yet whispers tell us that this child too was lost, perhaps a boy born too soon, too fragile for life. The grief must have hollowed her, those long nights in her chamber, clutching her rosary, praying through clenched teeth, knowing that every miscarriage was another crack in her crown. And Henry's affection, once burning, began to cool. His gaze, once fixed upon Anne's dark, quick eyes, now drifted elsewhere. Anne's wit, which had once enthralled him, now stung. Her sharp words, her jealousy, her refusal to bow her head like Catherine had done, grated against his pride. He was a king who demanded adoration, not defiance. Picture, and in those days, still radiant in her gowns of crimson and gold, her French hoods perched at just the right angle, her jewels glittering like captured stars. She played the role of queen with brilliance, presiding over masques, banquets, and courtly debates. She patronized scholars, defended reformers, stood boldly at Henry's side as the Church of England was born. She was more than a queen consort, she was a partner in power. But power is a dangerous thing in a court built on envy and betrayal. Thomas Cromwell, once her ally, began to turn against her. He had been the architect of Henry's break with Rome, the destroyer of monasteries, the king's hammer. But Anne, with her fierce opinions and sharp tongue, challenged him too often, thwarted his plans to seize church wealth, demanded that funds be spent on education and the poor. For Cromwell, this was not merely inconvenient, it was intolerable. The courtiers began to whisper, "The king grows weary of her. She cannot bear a son. She quarrels too boldly." Every eye in the palace became a spyglass, every word a weapon sharpened in secret. And then came 1536, the year of unraveling. In January, Catherine of Aragon, Anne's greatest rival, the woman she had displaced, died at Kimbolton Castle. On the surface, it seemed Anne's triumph was complete. Catherine was gone, buried in Peterborough Abbey. Some even say Anne wore yellow to celebrate, though others insist it was a color of mourning in Spain. But fate is cruel. For within weeks, Anne herself miscarried again. And this time, the loss was devastating. A male child, the son Henry so desperately longed for, stillborn at around 15 weeks. Can you imagine the silence in that chamber? The way the midwives looked away, the way Anne clutched the tiny, lifeless form, knowing with every fiber of her being that her crown was slipping from her grasp. Henry's reaction was cold, brutal. "I see that God will not give me male children by her," he is said to have muttered. And there, in that moment of grief, Anne's fall truly began. Henry's eyes had already strayed to Jane Seymour, one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting. Pale, demure, quiet, everything Anne was not. Jane knew how to bow her head, how to play the obedient maiden. She held herself back, just as Anne once had, offering Henry the tantalizing promise of virtue yet unconquered. And saw it, of course. How could she not? She quarreled with Jane, snatched from her a locket that bore the king's portrait. But jealousy made her appear desperate, and desperation is poison in a court where composure is survival. The whispers around and grew louder, darker. Cromwell sharpened his schemes, aligning himself with Henry's waning affection. If Anne could not be destroyed by childbirth, she would be destroyed by rumor. Tales began to spread. Anne had lovers. Anne was faithless. Anne had betrayed the king not only with strangers but with her own brother, George Boleyn. It was treason. It was unthinkable. It was also a lie carefully spun. But Anne's wit, once her strength, betrayed her. She teased too boldly, joked too freely, spoke words that, twisted by enemies, sounded like confessions of treason. You look for dead men's shoes. She once jested to Henry Norris, a courtier, suggesting he waited for Henry's death to marry her. Harmless? Perhaps. But to Cromwell's ears, it was a noose. Do you feel the air tightening? The flicker of danger in every corridor? Anne, once untouchable, now found herself ensnared. The courtiers who had once adored her avoided her gaze. The king who had once written her love letters now smiled at Jane Seymour instead. Anne's rise had been meteoric, dazzling, impossible. But every rise in Henry's court carried within it the shadow of the fall. And so the shadow deepened, lengthening across the palace floors. Soon, it would stretch to the tower itself, and Anne would walk within it, her crown already a ghost upon her brow. But before the blade, before the executioner, before the silence that would follow her last breath, there must first come the trial, the conspiracies, the accusations, the betrayals. And that, my friend, is where we must go next. Into the heart of a plot spun not from truth, but from envy and vengeance. The conspiracy against Anne Boleyn. The air in the court grows colder. Not from the season, but from the sudden stillness that falls when rumors begin to coil through the corridors like smoke. Anne Boleyn's crown trembles on her head, her enemies circle closer, and in this tightening noose of suspicion, the first victim is chosen. He is not a lord, not a knight, not a man of power. He is a musician. A servant of sound, a player of strings. Mark Smeaton. Can you see him? A young man barely 30, his hands callous from the lute and the virginals, his face boyish still. Born low, the son of a carpenter, raised far from the glitter of crowns, he had risen to the king's court by talent alone. He played for queens, for banquets, for masques. His music filled the long evenings when courtiers feasted and kings dreamed. For a man of his station, to be in such company was both blessing and danger. In Anne's household, Mark was often present. He strummed soft melodies while ladies embroidered, while the queen herself spoke sharply of politics or teased her circle with quick wit. Perhaps Anne laughed at him once, or asked him to play her favorite song. Perhaps he flushed with pride when she noticed his talent. It was enough, more than enough, for whispers to bloom. For in Henry's court, proximity to the queen was peril. A look could be twisted, a word turned into a weapon. And when Cromwell sought names to weave into his plot, Mark Smeaton's was easy prey. The first rumors began quietly, that Mark had grown too familiar, that he lingered too long in the queen's chambers. He was not of noble birth. He could not defend himself with the shield of family or title. His very lowliness made him suspect, for in the poisonous imagination of the court, what could be more scandalous than a queen lowering herself to a commoner? One evening in April 1536, he was taken. Perhaps he was surprised, dragged from his rooms at Greenwich or Whitehall by the king's men. Perhaps he already sensed the danger and trembled. He was brought to Cromwell's interrogators. There would be no gentle questions, no fairness. There was only the demand for confession, and the tools to carve it from him. Picture the chamber, the air thick with smoke from torches, the walls echoing with his cries. They pressed him, beat him, twisted him until his body broke and his will shattered. Torture in Tudor England was no metaphor. Some say he was racked, stretched until sinews tore. Others claim he was threatened with worse, starved, left in darkness until his mind unhinged. At last, Mark confessed. What did he confess to? To adultery with the Queen. To treason against the King. Lies, perhaps forced into his mouth by agony. Or perhaps words he thought might save him, if he gave the men what they wanted. But confession in those days was not salvation, it was a death sentence signed in his own blood. His name was written down, his words recorded. And with those words, Cromwell had the thread he needed. If a low-born musician had lain with the Queen, then surely others had too. The conspiracy grew, each name plucked like a note on a lute string, the music twisting into something grotesque. Do you feel it? The court now buzzes with whispers of scandal. Anne's enemies smirk in corridors, her friends grow pale and silent. The king himself, Henry, who once wrote love letters burning with desire, turns cold. Perhaps he believes the lies. Perhaps he chooses to believe, for it gives him what he wants, freedom, an end to Anne, and the path cleared toward Jane Seymour. And Mark Smeaton? He is left broken, discarded, a pawn sacrificed on the altar of politics. His confession is paraded as truth, his body wasted by torment, his honor stripped. A carpenter's son who dared to play for queens, now condemned as the instrument of her ruin. The tragedy is sharp, almost cruel in its irony. Mark's only true crime was proximity, the fatal misfortune of being noticed in a court where notice was as deadly as neglect. His strings once made music for joy, now they are silent, and his name becomes a curse tied to Anne's downfall. Soon he will be tried, though the verdict is already written. Soon he will be led to the scaffold. His young life ended not for what he did, but for what others needed him to have done. And yet his death will not stand alone. For Cromwell's net has been cast wide, and more names have been drawn into the tangle, men of higher rank, men of closer blood. The conspiracy deepens now. We walk further into the shadows where truth and lies entwine, where brother betrays sister, and where even a queen's laughter can be twisted into a crime. The conspiracy against Anne Boleyn has begun. The corridors of Whitehall echo with a silence that feels staged, as though every polished stone and gilded arch is listening, waiting. A queen still walks here, her gowns rustling, her laughter quick and sharp, but the air is already poisoned. Her allies are drifting, her enemies closing ranks, and the first drops of blood have already been wrung from a frightened musician's body. Mark Smeaton has confessed. Whether true or false hardly matters. His words have given Thomas Cromwell a blade, and now he sharpens it against the crown itself. Cromwell was a master of shadows. Once Anne's ally, he had risen alongside her in Henry's favor, dismantling the monasteries and lining the king's coffers with their wealth. But Anne, too bold, too demanding, had crossed him. She scorned his schemes, quarreled with him openly, mocked his loyalties. And Cromwell was not a man to forgive insults lightly. In the shifting sands of Henry's court, survival depended on sensing the king's mood before he spoke it aloud. Cromwell sensed it. Henry was weary of Anne. Weary of her sharp tongue, her miscarriages, her failure to give him the son he craved. And in that weariness, Cromwell saw opportunity. So the conspiracy began. Quietly, carefully, like ink spreading through parchment. Names were whispered, glances noted, gestures twisted into evidence. George Boleyn, the Queen's own brother, handsome, proud, and dangerously close to Anne, his intimacy was painted as incest. Henry Norris, a trusted gentleman of the chamber, accused of waiting for Henry's death to marry Anne. William Brereton, Francis Weston, men of the court, chosen not because of guilt but because their removal would please the king or balance political scales. And Mark Smeaton, of course, the scapegoat whose confession could be played like a drumbeat beneath the others. Imagine Cromwell at his desk, quill scratching in the candlelight, building the case like a mason laying bricks. He knew it did not need to be true. In Henry's England, truth was whatever the king desired. What mattered was plausibility. What mattered was giving Henry a way out of his marriage, a reason that would satisfy not only his conscience but also the law. Adultery with the queen was treason, and treason demanded death. Anne herself seemed almost unaware at first. Perhaps she felt secure, still believing Henry's love might protect her. She sparred with Jane Seymour, yes, saw the danger in that pale shadow of a woman who lingered at Henry's side. But did she imagine that her own brother, her own friends, would be accused of sharing her bed? Could she imagine the net tightening with such cruelty? In late April 1536, the arrests began. Norris was seized, then Brereton and Weston. George Boleyn followed, accused of crimes so monstrous that even hardened courtiers whispered in disbelief. Yet disbelief was dangerous, and silence safer. Anne, too, was taken, summoned from her apartments at Greenwich, her composure shattering as she was led to the Tower of London. Pause here. Imagine her ride through the city she had once dazzled, past crowds who had once cheered her coronation. The river carried her now, not as a triumphant queen but as a prisoner. The tower loomed above her, its grey stones cold against the sky. Once she had entered those gates for her coronation banquet, greeted with pageantry and promise. Now the same gates swallowed her in silence, and the shadows of traitors past pressed close. Inside, she was lodged in the same royal apartments she had occupied before her crowning, a bitter mockery. There she awaited her fate, pacing, praying, protesting her innocence. She wept, she raged, she laughed wildly in despair. The women assigned to watch her reported every word to Cromwell, feeding the fire with her every sigh. The trials were swift, brutal, inevitable. Evidence was scant, the charges absurd, but in Tudor England trials were theatre, not justice. The accused men were paraded first. Mark Smeaton, broken by torture, repeated his confession. Norris denied it, Brereton denied it, Weston denied it. George Boleyn defended himself with brilliance, but brilliance could not shield him. The verdict was foregone. Guilty. 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 Then came Anne's turn. She faced her accusers with defiance, her eyes flashing, her voice steady. She swore her innocence, denied every charge, mocked the flimsy evidence. But her fate was sealed long before she spoke. The peers of the realm, cowed by the king's will, declared her guilty. The sentence was death, burned or beheaded at the king's pleasure. Do you feel the weight of it? The betrayal layered upon betrayal? Her brother condemned alongside her, her companions sacrificed to Cromwell's ambition, Henry's love curdled into indifference. And yet, beneath it all, the conspiracy was not only about removing a queen. It was about rewriting history. By erasing Anne, by branding her a whore, a traitor, a witch, Henry could cleanse his conscience, legitimize his new passion for Jane Seymour, and silence the memory of the passion that had once torn a kingdom from Rome. The conspiracy was successful. The verdict delivered. The Tower prepared. And in the stillness of those final days, Anne waited. She prayed, she wrote letters, she stared from her window at the green lawns where others walked free. Perhaps she wondered how love, so fiery, so consuming, could turn so swiftly to ashes. Perhaps she wondered if history would remember her as queen or as monster. Soon enough, she would walk to the scaffold. Soon enough, the blade would fall. But before the end, let us linger here, in the shadow of the conspiracy itself, the machinery of lies, the cold precision of Cromwell's design, the silence of courtiers who dared not speak the truth. For it was not only Anne who was condemned in those days, but the very notion of love in Henry's court. To love was to risk treason. To stand too close was to fall. And now, the Queen herself must walk the last, most terrible path. The execution of Anne Boleyn waits ahead, her final performance before the eyes of England and the gaze of eternity. The Tower of London lies heavy beneath the May sky. Its walls, cold and immovable, seem to draw the breath from the air itself. Inside, time stretches and bends, each hour marked not by bells but by the restless heartbeat of a queen awaiting death. Anne Boleyn, once radiant, once triumphant, once beloved by a king, now walks her final days within stone chambers that had once sung with celebration at her coronation feast. How strange, how cruel, that the same fortress that welcomed her as queen should now hold her as prisoner. She knows the end is near. She has seen it in the eyes of her jailers, in the nervous deference of the ladies assigned to watch her, in the hurried movements of servants avoiding her gaze. She has heard the muffled sound of carpenters at work in the yard, building the scaffold. That hollow thud of hammer on wood is more terrible than any trumpet of war. At first, her spirit flickers wildly, veering from laughter to despair. One moment she protests her innocence, swearing to God she never betrayed Henry. The next, she collapses in tears, convinced the whole world conspires against her. And perhaps it does. Even her words, spoken in fear, are carried out to Cromwell by the women ordered to spy on her. But as the days pass, something in her hardens. Her fire, which once dazzled and consumed, now burns clear, steady, unwavering. If she cannot live as queen, she will die as one. Henry does not visit her. He does not even write. Once he promised her the world. Now, he prepares to wed another. Jane Seymour waits in the wings, pale and silent, her modest eyes lowered. Henry feasts, hunts, laughs loudly with courtiers who dare not mention Anne's name. The king who once broke a church for her now erases her with the stroke of a quill and the swing of a blade. The sentence has been given, death by the sword. Not the axe. Henry, in a strange gesture of mercy or guilt, has summoned a French executioner, renowned for his swiftness. It is a cleaner death, more elegant, more befitting a queen, or so the court whispers. Yet what comfort is that to Anne, whose life is to be severed in an instant, her breath cut short on a scaffold before the eyes of strangers. The morning of May 19, 1536, dawns pale and chill. Anne rises early, dressed carefully in a gown of dark damask, her hood framing her face, her hands steady as she folds them in prayer. She receives the sacrament with serene composure, declaring her innocence once more. To those around her she speaks gently, thanking them, comforting them, even as her own fate looms closer with every tick of unseen time. And then comes the call. The doors open, and she steps into the light. The courtyard is already filled, nobles, guards, curious onlookers who have crowded to witness the fall of a queen. The scaffold stands before her, stark against the morning sky, its wood pale and fresh from the carpenter's hand. Around it, silence hangs heavy, broken only by the caw of a distant crow. Imagine yourself there, standing among the crowd. You hear the shuffle of her feet upon the stones, the rustle of her gown as she climbs the steps. You see her glance upward, her face calm now, almost luminous, as though she has already made her peace with God. She speaks. Her voice, clear and strong, carries across the hushed assembly. She does not accuse. She does not rail against Henry. Instead, she praises the king, declaring him a gentle and sovereign lord, and commends her soul to God. It is not truth, but necessity. To speak otherwise would endanger her daughter, Elizabeth, and Anne knows too well the cost of defiance. So she bends her final words into a prayer for mercy, not for herself, but for those she leaves behind. And then, the final moments. She kneels upon the straw, her ladies weeping as they tie a blindfold over her eyes. She tucks her gown carefully about her feet, so that she will not fall ungracefully. Even now, she thinks of dignity, of composure, of how history will see her. Her lips move in prayer. To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesus, receive my soul. The French swordsman, summoned at great cost, steps forward. He calls for his assistant to hand him his weapon, distracting and with a sudden movement. She turns her head, instinctively, and in that instant the blade flashes. One swift stroke, and the world falls silent. It is over. A gasp ripples through the crowd, a sound swallowed quickly by the cold stone walls. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, lies still upon the scaffold, her dark hair spilling across the straw, her body severed from her head. A woman who had changed the course of nations, who had dared to refuse a king and in doing so toppled an empire, now reduced to silence in a single breath. The crowd disperses, some in awe, some in horror, many in uneasy silence. The executioner gathers his weapon, his duty done. Anne's ladies, trembling, lift her remains to be buried in an arrow chest within the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, unmarked, unceremonious. No crown, no monument, only whispers that will echo through the centuries. Yet Anne's death is not an ending. It is a beginning. Her daughter, Elizabeth, will one day rule England with a fire and brilliance that outshines even Henry's might. And Anne herself, though branded a traitor, will live on in legend, as seductress, as martyr, as queen. The scaffold is taken down. The straw is swept away. The stones of the tower grow quiet once more. But if you stand there, in that courtyard, and close your eyes, perhaps you can still hear it, the rustle of her gown, the murmur of her last prayer, the swift whisper of the sword as it cut through history itself. And as silence falls, another woman steps forward into the king's gaze. Gentle, yielding, obedient, everything and was not. Jane Seymour. The silent victor. The scaffold is gone now, dismantled plank by plank, as though the wood itself wished to forget what it had witnessed. The tower grows quiet again, but in its stones, the memory of Anne's fall lingers like a chill. Henry does not linger on grief. He does not brood over the wife he once worshipped, nor the mother of the daughter who will one day outshine him. No, Henry looks forward, as ever, with restless hunger. And there, already waiting, is Jane Seymour. Jane. The contrast could not be sharper. Where Anne was dark-eyed fire and quicksilver wit, Jane is pale calm, a still pool reflecting obedience. Wherein dazzled with clever words, Jane speaks softly, cautiously, her tongue sheathing itself in submission. She has been at court for years, a lady in waiting first to Catherine of Aragon, then to Anne. She has watched queens rise and fall, studied every whisper, every glance, every fatal misstep. If Anne played the game boldly, Jane plays it quietly, with downcast eyes and folded hands. Do you see her? A woman of modest bearing, fair hair neatly tucked beneath her hood, her gown simple by comparison to Anne's French extravagance. She does not laugh loudly, she does not argue in council, she does not sparkle with dangerous intelligence. And perhaps that is why Henry sees in her not only comfort but salvation. After years of storm, Jane is calm weather. Anne's body is barely cold when Henry turns to Jane. Within days of the execution, he is betrothed. Within weeks, married. To the world, it seems indecently swift, but Henry does not care. He has justified his passion with blood. He has cleared his path with steel. And now, he places his hope once more in a new queen's womb. Jane plays her role perfectly. She does not confront him. She does not argue. She listens, she soothes. She presents herself as the dutiful wife, the gentle intercessor. When courtiers approach, she does not demand, she entreats. When Henry roars with temper, she bows her head until the storm passes. He calls her, "My true and humble wife." He sets aside memories of Anne's defiance and Catherine's obstinacy, finding in Jane the quiet echo of what he believes a queen should be. But make no mistake, Jane is no fool. Her humility masks calculation. She knows what Henry craves, a son, and she knows that her survival depends on giving him one. She encourages reconciliation between Henry and his daughter Mary, Catherine's child, positioning herself as a peacemaker. This earns her respect among the people, who had despised Anne. She cultivates an image of gentle virtue, even as her family, the Seymours, rise rapidly in power, basking in her favor. The court shifts around her. Those who whispered against and now sing Jane's praises. Her brothers, Edward and Thomas Seymour, grow bold, grasping at titles and offices. For in the Tudor court, a queen's womb is not merely her own, it is a ladder for her kin. And then, in early 1537, hope stirs. Jane is with child. Imagine the tension of those months. The court holds its breath, Henry more so than any. He dotes upon her, shields her, guards her every movement. Jane's pregnancy is watched like an omen. The midwives are consulted, the astrologers mutter their predictions, the kingdom prays. For 20 years Henry has longed for a son. 2 queens have failed him. If Jane succeeds, she will secure not only her crown but her place in history. October comes. The air grows chill, the leaves burn red and gold. And within Hampton Court, Jane goes into labor. The labor is long, excruciating, dragging on for days. Henry paces the halls, his face grim, his prayers fervent. At last, on October 12th, a cry echoes through the chamber, a healthy baby boy. Edward, Prince of Wales. Henry's longed-for son, his heir, the promise of the Tudor line. The bells ring across the realm. Cannons thunder. Feasts are held. Henry is beside himself with joy, weeping openly, embracing courtiers, proclaiming Jane his savior. At last, he has the son Catherine could not give him, the son and had promised but never delivered. At last, his dynasty is secure. But joy in Henry's world is never pure. Jane does not recover. The long labor has torn her body, weakened her beyond repair. She lingers for days, pale and fevered, her strength ebbing as the kingdom rejoices. She sees her son baptized, she hears the cannons fire in his honor, but she knows she will not see him grow. On October 24th, just 12 days after giving England its prince, Jane Seymour dies. Henry is devastated. For all his swift discarding of wives, for all his ruthless pragmatism, Jane's death strikes him to the core. She gave him what he craved most, and in return, she paid with her life. He clothes himself in mourning, speaks of her with reverence, calls her his true wife. Unlike Catherine, unlike Anne, Jane is never reviled, never cast aside. She becomes the idealized queen, the silent victor. Even in death, she triumphs. Henry orders that when his own time comes, he will be buried beside her. Not Catherine, the Spanish princess who defied him. Not Anne, the firebrand who changed his kingdom. Jane. The quiet, gentle Jane. In the end, she alone remains at Henry's side, entombed beside him in Windsor, the queen who gave him a son and asked for nothing more. And so the court shifts once again. The Seymours rise, then falter, their fortunes tied to Edward's fragile life. The courtiers whisper of Henry's grief, but grief in Tudor England is fleeting. A king cannot remain alone. Even as he mourns Jane, ambassadors begin to whisper of new brides, new alliances. For Henry's hunger, for power, for companionship, for the endless promise of sons, cannot be stilled. But Jane Seymour remains untouched by scandal. In the gallery of Henry's queens, she alone wears no stain of disgrace. She came quietly, she gave him a son, and she left before his love could curdle. The silent victor. And now, in the wake of her death, the corridors stir once more. For another woman will be brought to Henry, a stranger from across the sea. And unlike Jane, she will not win his heart, but she will win something far more precious: survival. And of Clevy's waits in the wings. The bells that tolled for Jane Seymour's death have faded, their echoes swallowed by time. Henry is left with his long-awaited son, the infant Edward, cradled as England's fragile hope. Yet even in his grief, even as he broods over Jane's memory with uncharacteristic tenderness, the machinery of politics never halts. A king cannot remain alone. The succession demands security, alliances demand tending, and courtiers whisper endlessly of the next queen who must step into Jane's shadow. Henry is older now. The years of feasting, jousting, and restless passion have taken their toll. His body grows heavy, his leg wounds fester, his temper quickens. Yet he remains a king, and a king must marry. But this time, the choice is not born of love, or even lust. This time, it is strategy. Enter Anne of Cleves. She was no glittering French courtier, no sharp-tongued seductress like Anne Boleyn, nor a gentle English rose like Jane Seymour. Anne was a princess of the German states, from the Duchy of Cleves, raised in the sober, practical world of Protestant reform. Her education was limited. She could not play the lute, nor dance with elegance, nor embroider verses into tapestries. But she could manage a household, and her family offered Henry what he needed most, an alliance. Picture the moment. Henry, ever the restless monarch, receives reports from his envoys. Europe is a chessboard, and he is always calculating. The Pope remains his enemy, Spain his rival, France unpredictable. But in the Protestant states of Germany, there is opportunity. An alliance with Cleves, through marriage to Anne, could strengthen England against the Catholic powers. Cromwell, ever the architect of Henry's policies, presses the match. It is sound, it is strategic, it is necessary. But Henry is still Henry, and vanity is his constant companion. He must know what this and looks like. Portraits are commissioned, the artist Hans Holbein dispatched. Holbein paints her with gentle eyes, fair hair, a serene expression. Henry, gazing at the image, nods with satisfaction. She is fair. He agrees to the marriage, his mind filled with hope of politics secured and beauty gained. The winter of 1540 arrives, and with it Anne herself. Imagine her journey, leaving behind the Rhineland, boarding ships that cut across the Channel's bitter waters, approaching the cold grey shores of England. She speaks little English. She knows little of Henry, save what she has been told, that he is powerful, wealthy, and her destiny. Henry, impatient as ever, cannot wait for the formal ceremonies. He disguises himself, though by this point his bulk and bearing make disguises absurd, and rides to Rochester to surprise his bride. The meeting is infamous. And tired from travel, unprepared for ceremony, sees a strange man bursting into her chambers, embracing her with boisterous energy. She does not recognize him. She does not bow, does not fall to her knees. She turns away, confused. Henry, stung to his pride, recoils. She is nothing so fair as she hath been reported. He mutters bitterly. From that moment, the marriage is doomed. Yet it proceeds. Politics demands it. On January 6, 1540, in Greenwich, Anne and Henry are wed. She wears the dignity of a queen, but Henry is already disenchanted. He whispers complaints to Cromwell, grumbling that she is too plain, too ungainly, that her body does not stir him. He calls her a Flanders mare, cruel words that echo through history. Their wedding night is no better. Henry, ever frank about his appetites, complains that he cannot consummate the marriage. He declares that he finds her unattractive, that he feels no desire. Anne, bewildered and humiliated, insists she has done her duty. But the king, dissatisfied, spreads his grievance through the court. Whispers grow. The queen is untouched, the marriage a farce. Cromwell, who had arranged the match, grows nervous. His enemies circle, smelling blood. The queen, through no fault of her own, is caught in the crossfire of ambition. And yet, Anne survives. Here lies her genius, hidden beneath her quiet exterior. She does not fight Henry. She does not argue. She yields with grace. When Henry presses for annulment, she agrees. She testifies that the marriage was never consummated, that she remains untouched. She releases him, gently, with no bitterness in her words. And in return, Henry rewards her. Unlike Catherine, who defied him, unlike Anne Boleyn, who sparred with him, and of Cleves bows and lives. Henry grants her a generous settlement, riches, lands, palaces. She is styled the king's sister, given precedence over nearly every noblewoman in England, She is free from the peril of Henry's bed, free from the deadly scrutiny that destroyed his other wives. Imagine her life after. She retires to country estates, her halls filled with tapestries and gardens, her coffers brimming. She visits court on occasion, welcomed warmly, respected for her dignity. She befriends Henry's daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, treating them with kindness that endears her to history. She lives not in fear, not in disgrace, but in comfort, an extraordinary survival in a world where queens were too often sacrificed to Henry's whims. And Cromwell? The architect of her marriage pays dearly. Henry blames him for the fiasco, for the humiliation of a union he could not stomach. Cromwell falls from grace, accused of treason, executed in the Tower. His head rolls, while Anne, quiet, gracious, smiling softly, sips wine in her manner, untouched. It is a strange irony. The queen Henry did not desire becomes the queen who thrives. She alone outlives him, watching from the sidelines as Jane's son Edward takes the throne, as Mary reigns and burns heretics, as Elizabeth claims the crown and rules in fire and brilliance. Through it all, Anne of Cleves remains safe, secure, remembered not for passion or tragedy, but for wisdom. For in Henry's world, to fight was to perish. To yield was to survive. And Anne of Cleves, the queen Henry scorned, proved the wisest of them all. But Henry's hunger does not rest. Even as Anne lives in comfort, Henry turns once more to youth, to beauty, to dangerous temptation. His eyes fall upon a girl barely more than a child, a rose without thorns, doomed by her own innocence. Catherine Howard waits in the shadows, and with her, the wheel of fortune turns again toward blood. The halls of Hampton Court are restless again. The echo of Anne of Cleves' quiet dignity still lingers, yet Henry has already turned his gaze elsewhere. He is older now, swollen in body, limping from his festering leg wounds, his temper sharpened to cruelty by years of disappointment. And yet, despite his decline, his appetite for beauty, for youth, for the fleeting illusion of renewal, still burns with the hunger of a man who refuses to acknowledge the shadow of age. Into this dangerous fire steps Catherine Howard. She is young. Too young, some whisper. A girl barely in her late teens, raised not with the solemnity of Catherine of Aragon nor the sharp schooling of Anne Boleyn, but in the lax, unruly household of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. There discipline was loose, the girls left to themselves in dormitory-like chambers where laughter, flirtations, and reckless games flourished. Catherine was not cloistered, not guarded. She grew in an atmosphere of indulgence, where secrets flourished in corners and stolen kisses passed unnoticed. Do you see her? Lively, playful, her dark eyes sparkling with mischief. She is no scholar, no philosopher. She does not quote scripture like Catherine of Aragon, nor debate theology like Anne Boleyn. But she dances lightly, she smiles sweetly, she sings with a voice that flutters the heart. For a king burdened with age and pain, Catherine is the vision of spring itself, fresh, fragrant, a rose in bloom. Henry sees her, and he is entranced. She is brought into his orbit by the Duke of Norfolk, her ambitious uncle, who sees in her a chance to restore Howard influence at court. Once again, the family maneuvers, offering a niece to sate the king's desire. And Catherine, bright, naive, eager for favor, becomes queen. In July 1540, within days of Anne of Cleves' annulment, Henry weds her. The contrast is almost grotesque. He, in his late 40s, vast in body, plagued by sores, temper, and paranoia. She, scarcely 20, her youth glowing like a candle. And yet, to Henry, she is perfection. He calls her his rose without a thorn, lavishing her with jewels, gowns, and affection. He parades her at court, leaning heavily on his staff yet smiling with pride at the radiant girl on his arm. For Catherine brings him not only beauty, but the illusion that time has not conquered him. But beneath the silk and music lies danger. For Catherine's past is not as innocent as Henry believes. Before she was queen, in the Duchess's free-spirited household, she had known men. There was Henry Manox, her music tutor, whose attentions went far beyond the proper. There was Francis Dereham, with whom she exchanged tokens and promises of affection, so intimate that some whispered they had pledged themselves as husband and wife. These liaisons, reckless in youth, forgotten perhaps by Catherine herself, now lurk like shadows waiting to be exposed. At first, the court blooms with joy. Catherine's laughter fills the halls, her gowns shimmer with cloth of gold, her youth rekindles Henry's pride. He dotes on her, showers her with affection that seems almost desperate. The courtiers, weary of Cromwell's iron grip, rejoice in the king's happiness. But Catherine, though queen, is still a girl. Surrounded by flatterers, by music and dance, she is drawn again into the web of youthful folly. And into that web steps Thomas Culpeper. Culpeper is handsome, ambitious, a courtier who knows how to move in shadows. His closeness to Catherine begins innocently enough, conversations, glances, but soon grows dangerous. Whispers begin, late-night meetings, secret letters, a passion blooming in the very heart of the king's palace. Whether it was consummated or not, whether Catherine truly betrayed Henry in flesh as well as spirit, remains blurred by history. But in Henry's court, rumor alone is enough to condemn. Meanwhile, enemies stir. Archbishop Cranmer, ever vigilant, receives hints of Catherine's past with Dereham. He investigates quietly, uncovering fragments of truth. Each testimony, each confession, is another stone laid upon the path to ruin. And once again, as with Anne Boleyn, the king's court becomes a theater of betrayal. When the truth reaches Henry, his rage is beyond description. Imagine him, red-faced, trembling with fury, his leg bandaged, his pride wounded deeper than flesh. This girl, this child he had raised to queen, whom he had adored as his rose without a thorn, has shamed him. His love turns to loathing, his passion to cruelty. Catherine is seized, her companions questioned, her household torn apart. Francis Dereham is dragged into the light, his old affections twisted into treason. Culpeper too is accused, his intimacy with the queen painted as adultery. Torture wrings from them the words the crown demands. Catherine herself is confined. At first, she weeps, frantic, pleading. She writes desperate letters to Henry, begging for mercy, insisting on her love for him, swearing her innocence. "I die a queen, but I would rather die the wife of Culpeper." Some accounts claim she cried in despair. Yet mercy is not in Henry's heart now. He has been humiliated. He has been betrayed. And betrayal, for Henry, demands blood. In December 1541, Francis Dereham and Thomas Culpeper are executed. Dereham suffers the full horror of a traitor's death, hanged, drawn, and quartered. Culpeper, spared the worst by Henry's former affection, is beheaded. Their bodies fall, and Catherine's fate is sealed. She is moved to the Tower. Do you hear the echo of Anne's footsteps in those same corridors, just 5 years before? Catherine, like Anne, is young, radiant yet doomed. But unlike Anne, Catherine does not possess sharp wit or queenly poise. She is terrified, broken. On February 13, 1542, she is led to the scaffold on Tower Green. The crowd gathers, grim-faced, expectant. Catherine is only about 20 years old. She trembles, her face pale beneath her hood, her youth cruelly stark against the grey morning. And then, legend whispers, she speaks words that pierce the ages. Some say she declares, "I die a queen, but I would rather die the wife of Culpeper." Others insist she makes no such confession, that she prays instead for the king's long life. What is certain is that she kneels, her small frame bending before the block, her hands shaking as she arranges her gown. The axe falls. The rose without a thorn lies broken, her petals scattered in blood. Her story is one of innocence corrupted, of folly punished with the harshest of justice. Unlike Catherine of Aragon, she did not fight. Unlike Anne Boleyn, she did not burn with ambition. Catherine Howard's tragedy was simply this: she was too young, too unguarded, too reckless in a court where recklessness was death. Henry buries her memory quickly. He does not idealize her, as he did Jane Seymour. He does not revile her, as he did Anne. He simply erases her. Yet her ghost lingers still. In the tower, they say, her spirit runs along the corridor, crying out for mercy, forever fleeing toward the chapel where the block awaited. The doomed rose without thorns, plucked too soon, forever haunts the place of her fall. And Henry, ever restless, ever hungry, moves on once more. His heart is scarred, his body failing, yet he still seeks companionship. His next queen will not be young and naive, nor fiery and dangerous. She will be something different entirely, an educated, cautious woman, who will survive him not by beauty or by passion, but by wit. Catherine Parr awaits, the queen who outsmarted death. The tower grows quiet after Catherine Howard's fall, yet her story cannot be told in the dry ink of dates and proclamations alone. No, her fate was sealed not only by her childhood folly or her youthful recklessness, but by something far more dangerous in Henry's court: forbidden love. To understand her doom, we must walk back into those gilded corridors and watch, candle in hand, as she drifts into the arms of Thomas Culpeper. Thomas was no stranger at court. Handsome, well-born, with the easy charm of a man used to catching glances, he served in Henry's privy chamber. This was no small honor. The men of the privy chamber attended the king at his most private moments, sharing his hunts, his feasts, even his dressing chambers. They were trusted, envied, watched. And Culpeper was one of the brightest among them, witty and magnetic. His reputation, though, was shadowed. There were whispers of violence, of an attempted assault covered up by his status. Yet in the shimmering dance of the Tudor court, charm often outshone scandal. When Catherine Howard became queen, Culpeper found himself drawn into her orbit. Perhaps it began with glances exchanged across a hall, a shared smile at a mask, a word too warm for mere courtesy. Catherine, barely 20, adored beauty and flattery, and Culpeper offered both. Henry, limping and swollen, could never compete with the elegance of this younger man who moved with easy grace. For Catherine, caught in the gilded cage of her marriage, Culpeper must have seemed the embodiment of everything she longed for: youth, vitality, desire. At first, the meetings were innocent, or at least plausibly so. A word exchanged here, a stolen conversation there. But soon, the Queen's household was abuzz with murmurs. Catherine's old companion, Lady Rochford, the widow of Anne Boleyn's brother George, became the go-between. Ambitious, resentful, perhaps reckless herself, she carried messages, arranged meetings. In the hush of night, in the hidden chambers of palaces, Catherine and Culpeper met. Imagine those encounters: the Queen slipping away, her silks whispering against stone, her heart racing at every creak of the floorboards. The flicker of a torch casting shadows across the walls as she steals into a chamber where Culpeper waits, his breath quick with anticipation. Their words hurried, their touches cautious yet hungry. A kiss stolen in the dark, a letter pressed into trembling hands. One of those letters survives, written in Catherine's own hand, a fragment of her heart laid bare. "It makes my heart die to think I cannot always be in your company," she wrote to Culpeper. "I am yours and you are mine." Such words, tender and desperate, would later be paraded as evidence of treason. But in the moment, they were simply the cries of a young woman caught between duty and desire, her soul starving in a court where every smile was calculated, every gesture weighed. Their romance was fatal not only because it was forbidden, but because it unfolded under the gaze of watchful eyes. Servants noticed. Courtiers whispered. And in Henry's world, nothing remained secret for long. The king himself, at first, suspected nothing. He doted on Catherine, showered her with jewels, parading her as the joy of his age. But others saw the truth. Archbishop Cranmer received reports of Catherine's past with Francis Derham, and as he investigated, Culpeper's name surfaced. Letters, testimonies, whispers of midnight meetings, all became threads in a noose. When the accusations reached Henry, his fury knew no bounds. Culpeper and Derham were seized, dragged into interrogation. Under pressure, both confessed enough to damn themselves. Culpeper admitted to intending ill with the Queen, though he insisted they had not gone so far as to consummate their love. Derham, bitter and spurned, painted himself as Catherine's old paramour and accused her of betrayal. Their words, wrung by fear and threat, sealed Catherine's doom. The trial was brutal. Both men stood accused of treason, the most deadly of crimes. Derham, lacking noble birth, was condemned to the full horror of execution, hanged, drawn, and quartered. His body torn as a warning, his name cursed. Culpeper, though equally guilty in the eyes of the law, was granted the mercy of beheading, his head struck cleanly from his body. He died young, handsome still, his charms silenced by steel. Catherine's romance with Culpeper, whether physical or only emotional, was enough to damn her. For a queen, even desire was treason. In the logic of Henry's court, to dream of another man was to betray the king himself, to endanger the throne. And so her love became her death sentence. Picture it, Catherine in the Tower, clutching her rosary, her tears falling onto the cold stone floor. She knows her letters to Culpeper are in the king's hands. She knows her words, once whispered in passion, now echo as accusations. It makes my heart die to think I cannot always be in your company. What once was love is now treason. What once was desire is now doom. And so, on that February morning in 1542, when Catherine kneels before the block, it is Culpeper's ghost that walks beside her. She dies with his name still bound to hers, their fatal romance etched forever into history as a cautionary tale. The rose without a thorn, plucked too soon, lies still upon the scaffold. Beside her, in memory, lies the man she loved, both destroyed not by hatred, but by passion. In Henry's court, love itself was the deadliest crime of all. But the story does not end there. For even as Catherine's blood soaks the straw of Tower Green, another figure stands waiting in the wings. A woman older, wiser, far more cautious. A woman who has studied the fates of Catherine, of Anne, of Jane, of all who came before. She will not fight Henry with defiance, nor tempt him with reckless passion. Instead, she will bend, flatter, soothe, and in bending, she will survive. Catherine Parr, the queen who outsmarted death, awaits her turn. The silence after a beheading is unlike any other. It lingers, heavy and unspoken, as though the air itself recoils from the sudden end of a life. So it was with Catherine Howard, the girl who had been Henry's rose without a thorn. The laughing child queen whose youth had briefly rekindled his pride was gone, her bright petals cut away in the cold grey courtyard of the Tower. But the story of her fall, her ruin, begins not with the axe, but with whispers that grew like ivy, creeping and choking until no breath remained. Catherine's undoing began quietly, with suspicion. She had been queen for barely over a year when Archbishop Cranmer slipped a folded letter into Henry's hand. Imagine that moment, the king, seated in his privy chamber, his swollen legs stretched before him, his face pale with pain, glancing down at the paper with impatience. Cranmer, cautious and trembling, dares to suggest what no one else would speak aloud, that the queen is not chaste, that her past holds secrets unfit for Henry's bed. At first, Henry will not hear it. He roars in fury, tossing aside the letter, swearing vengeance on those who slander his beloved. Catherine is young, radiant, obedient. How could she be guilty? But doubt is a seed that once planted cannot be uprooted. It grows, twisting, feeding on Henry's paranoia. He begins to watch her more closely, to hear whispers he once ignored. The investigation begins in silence. Servants are questioned. ladies of her household are summoned. Francis Dereham, once her youthful companion in the Duchess of Norfolk's unruly household, is dragged into the light. He admits too much, too freely speaking of the Queen's past promises, their intimacy, their shared bed in younger years. His words, clumsy and desperate, tighten the snare. He names names. And one name, when spoken, rings like thunder: Thomas Culpeper. The Queen's household is torn apart. Letters are seized, interrogations conducted. The court, once filled with laughter and music, becomes a place of fear. Servants look away, courtiers bow silently, waiting to see which way the king's temper will turn. Catherine herself begins to sense the danger. She paces her chambers, her laughter faltering, her smiles brittle. Her youth, once her strength, now betrays her. She does not know how to navigate such peril. And then, Henry learns the truth. Or at least, the version of truth that his enemies and fears conspire to create. Catherine's meetings with Culpeper, her letter declaring, "It makes my heart die to think I cannot always be in your company." Her past with Dereham, all of it is laid before him. The king, who once paraded her as the joy of his later years, now feels only rage and humiliation. He has been mocked, deceived, made a cuckold in the eyes of his court and his God. For Henry, such betrayal is not merely personal, it is treason. When Catherine is confronted, she collapses in terror. She wails, she pleads, she denies. But the evidence, the letters, the confessions wrung from others, is enough to damn her. Panic-stricken, she flees through the corridors of Hampton Court, crying out for the king, desperate to plead her case in person. The guards stop her. She is dragged away, screaming, her cries echoing through the palace. "I am the queen! I must see the king! I must speak with him!" But Henry will not see her. He will not hear her voice again. She is confined, first to her chambers, then to the Tower itself. The same fortress that had claimed Anne Boleyn now claims her. In those final days, Catherine is a shadow of the girl who once danced with laughter. She weeps endlessly, her spirit broken. She is told she will die, and she knows the sentence is just a formality. For no queen accused of adultery has ever escaped the block. Francis Dereham and Thomas Culpeper meet their fates first. Their trials are swift, their verdicts predetermined. Dereham, seen as the corrupter of Catherine's youth, is condemned to the full horror of a traitor's execution, hanged, cut down still living, disemboweled, his body quartered. Culpeper, once Henry's favorite, is spared the worst, granted the mercy of beheading. Their deaths are brutal reminders to the court of the cost of loving too boldly in Henry's England. And then comes Catherine's turn. It is February 13th, 1542. The morning is cold, the sky heavy with grey clouds. Catherine is led from her chambers in the Tower, her steps unsteady, her face pale as linen. She is no longer the playful girl of her youth, no longer the laughing queen adorned in jewels. She is 19 or 20 years old, still scarcely more than a child, and she walks to her death. The scaffold on Tower Green stands ready, the straw laid thick upon its boards. A crowd gathers, somber, their breath rising in the cold air. Some pity her, some despise her, but all are silent, waiting. Catherine mounts the steps, her hands trembling, her lips moving in whispered prayer. She turns to address the crowd, her voice soft, shaking. She admits her guilt, not of treason, but of being unworthy of her high station. She asks forgiveness, she prays for the king's long life. And then, the final moment, she kneels, arranging her gown carefully about her, so that no immodesty will dishonor her in death. She places her head upon the block, her hair falling forward. The executioner, axe in hand, stands poised. Catherine whispers a final prayer, perhaps for mercy, perhaps for Culpeper, perhaps only for peace. The axe falls. And with it, another queen is erased. But Catherine's fall is not merely the story of one girl's folly. It is the story of a court that devoured innocence, of ambition that sacrificed daughters, of a king whose love was as dangerous as his wrath. Catherine Howard became queen by charm, by youth, by the schemes of her family, and she died for those same reasons. Her body is laid to rest beside Anne Boleyn's in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, two young women bound forever in tragedy, both executed in the same place, both undone by love and by Henry. The king grieves, or at least he pretends to. He speaks of betrayal, of shame, of divine justice. Yet he moves on, as he always does. The courtiers whisper of who will come next, of which woman will risk the perilous crown. For the Game of Thrones in Tudor England never pauses, not for blood, not for grief, not for the severed head of a queen. And so, from the ashes of Catherine Howard's fall, another figure rises. She is older, wiser, cautious. She has seen the fates of Catherine of Aragon, of Anne Boleyn, of Jane Seymour, of Anne of Cleves, of Catherine Howard. She has studied them all, and she knows how to survive where others have fallen. Her name is Catherine Parr, the queen who outsmarted death. The scaffold is swept clean, the echoes of Catherine Howard's last prayer fading into silence. Yet one figure lingers in the shadow of her tragedy, a woman older, wiser, yet bound by the same cruel threads of courtly intrigue. She has survived long past the fall of Anne Boleyn, long past the rise and ruin of Catherine Howard, long past her own husband's execution. But survival in Henry's court is never without cost, and hers is a story woven of betrayal, guilt, and a final reckoning. She is Lady Jane Rochford. Her name was once Jane Boleyn, born into a noble family, married into one of the most dazzling houses in England. Her husband was George Boleyn, brother to Anne, the radiant queen who had captivated Henry and torn England from Rome. Through her marriage, Jane was drawn into the glittering circle of the Boleyns, their star rising as Henry's passion blazed. But in the deadly fire of Anne's fall, Jane chose her side, and it was not with her husband. History remembers her testimony, damning George and Anne alike. When accusations of adultery and incest were spun around the queen, Jane lent her words to the charge. She claimed Anne and George were too familiar, too close. Perhaps she believed it. Perhaps she was coerced. Perhaps she was driven by jealousy, for her marriage to George was by all accounts bitter, loveless, filled with scorn. Whatever the reason, her words helped to condemn them. Anne and George mounted the scaffold, and Jane lived. Survival, yes, but not peace. For Jane remained at court, a widow haunted by whispers. Some called her a betrayer, a snake. Others pitied her. But in Henry's world, usefulness was everything, and Jane proved useful still. She served in the households of queens who followed, Jane Seymour, and of Cleves, Catherine Howard. Always she was there, a quiet figure in the background, her fate tied to the women she served. And it was with Catherine Howard that Jane's path turned fatal. Catherine, young and reckless, trusted Jane as confidant. It was Jane who carried messages between the Queen and Thomas Culpeper, Jane who arranged their secret meetings. Did she do it out of loyalty? Out of recklessness? Out of the weary recognition that queens were trapped birds who sought any sliver of freedom? We cannot know. But what is certain is that when Catherine's secrets spilled into the open, Jane was ensnared too. Dragged into interrogation, Jane at first denied everything. But under pressure, her defenses crumbled. She admitted her role as go-between. Worse still, rumors claimed she revealed lurid details, even suggesting Catherine confided in her about her passions for Culpeper. Once again, Jane's testimony became a dagger, and this time, the blade cut her own throat as well. For Henry was merciless. Catherine Howard's betrayal had humiliated him, and all who abetted her would pay. Jane was arrested, imprisoned in the Tower. At first, her mind seemed to unravel. Reports from her jailers describe her raving, incoherent, slipping into madness. Under English law, the insane could not be executed, But Henry, determined, changed the law. Even madness would not save her. Imagine her in those final days, pacing the same cold stone corridors where Anne and George once walked, hearing their ghosts in every echo. Did she remember her husband's face as he mounted the scaffold? Did she regret the words she had spoken that helped to send him there? Did she see, in Catherine Howard's youth and folly, the reflection of Anne's fire and defiance? Guilt must have pressed heavy, yet history grants her no clear confession, only silence and shadows. On February 13, 1542, the same day Catherine Howard was executed, Jane was led to her death. The scaffold was raised again on Tower Green, the straw freshly laid, the crowd assembled. She mounted the steps with composure restored, her madness seemingly burned away in the clarity of the end. She addressed the people, asking forgiveness, declaring her guilt, praying for the king. Then she knelt. The axe fell swiftly, and Jane's long survival ended. She was buried beside Anne and George in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, her bones mingling with those she had once betrayed. History, unkind, remembers her as both betrayer and victim, the woman who spoke against her husband, the woman who abetted a queen's fatal romance, the woman who lived too long and died too late. But her story lingers unsettling. Was she truly a viper, treacherous by choice? Or was she a woman caught in the machinery of a court that devoured all, where silence could damn as easily as speech? Did she betray, or was she used? In truth, perhaps she was both, betrayer and betrayed, complicit and condemned. And so her voice fades, leaving only the rattle of the axe and the whispers of the dead. Yet the story of Henry's queens does not end with blood on the straw. Another Catherine waits in the wings, not a child, not a temptress, but a woman of wit and resolve. She will wear the crown with caution, wielding not beauty or passion, but intellect. She will almost perish under Henry's suspicion, yet she will turn suspicion into survival. Catherine Parr is waiting, the queen who outsmarted death. The Tower is quiet once more. And George, Jane Rochford, Catherine Howard, all silenced by the axe. The grass grows green again over Tower Green, but beneath it the soil is heavy with blood. Henry, older now, limps through his palaces, swollen with age and rage, yet still restless, still searching. He has buried 4 wives, cast one aside, and annulled another. Still he is not finished. And so enters Catherine Parr. Her story is unlike the others. She is no young maiden dazzled by jewels, no fiery temptress whose wit ignites a king's passion. She is a woman of experience, tempered by sorrow, sharpened by learning. Twice widowed before she ever came to Henry's side, Catherine Parr knows too well the frailty of life and the fickleness of fortune. She carries herself with dignity, her auburn hair streaked with wisdom, her eyes calm, her voice steady. She has seen too much to be reckless, too much to be naive. When Henry notices her, she is not some fresh blossom plucked from a maiden's chamber. She is already bound in grief, mourning the death of her second husband, Lord Latimer. Yet in her widowhood she shines. She is intelligent, pious, gentle in manner but firm in conviction. She is, in short, everything Henry needs at this stage of his reign: a nurse, a companion, a stepmother for his children, a balm for his failing pride. The court, by now, has become a graveyard of queens. Catherine of Aragon, set aside. Anne Boleyn, beheaded. Jane Seymour, dead in childbirth. And of Cleves, set aside. Catherine Howard, beheaded. Every woman who has touched Henry's bed has paid dearly. Catherine Parr must have known this. And yet, when Henry proposed, she accepted. Not out of girlish passion, but out of duty, and perhaps calculation. But Catherine was not merely a survivor. She was a reformer at heart. A woman who read theology, who debated scripture, who believed passionately in the new Protestant faith stirring across Europe. She gathered scholars around her, patronized translations of the Bible into English, wrote prayers and reflections of her own. Imagine her chambers, quiet, candlelit, filled with books and the murmur of learned conversation, a queen's salon turned into a sanctuary of ideas. This, however, was perilous. For Henry, though he had torn England from Rome, remained in his heart a man of contradictions. He had cast off the Pope, but he did not tolerate heresy. He wanted obedience, not challenge. Catherine's Protestant leanings, her boldness in discussing faith, her influence over the young Elizabeth and Edward, made enemies stir. Conservative factions at court, jealous of her closeness to the king, whispered that she was dangerous, that she was leading Henry astray. One day, as Henry lay ill with the wound in his leg, Catherine dared to debate scripture with him. Perhaps she believed her role as queen gave her license, perhaps she thought him receptive. But Henry's temper flared. He snapped at her, his face darkening, his voice sharp. "Are you become a doctor, Kate? You are much mistaken. For in these matters you must believe me, and not be led by others." The words cut deep. Catherine knew then how thin the line was between favor and ruin. Her enemies saw their chance. The Lord Chancellor, Wriothesley, and Bishop Gardiner prepared articles of heresy against her. A warrant was drawn for her arrest. The Queen, intelligent though she was, had walked dangerously close to the fate of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. And then, salvation by wit. Catherine learned of the warrant before it was served. She went to Henry, not in defiance, but in submission. She knelt before him, her eyes lowered, her voice gentle. She told him she had never sought to instruct him, but only to divert his mind from the pain of his illness, to ease his burden by offering discourse. "I have always held it preposterous for a woman to instruct her lord," she said, "but if I have spoken, it was only to learn from your majesty." Henry's heart softened. Vanity was his weakness. To hear her flatter him, to see her submission, soothed his wounded pride. He forgave her, embraced her, declared her his most obedient wife. When the guards came the next day to arrest her, Henry himself sent them away, laughing at their ignorance. Catherine had outsmarted death itself. She remained queen, her position secure until Henry's own death in 1547. During those final years, she played her role with careful grace, nursing the king, reconciling him with his daughters Mary and Elizabeth, fostering the education of the young Edward. She created a semblance of harmony in a family torn apart by scandal and blood. She was not only queen, but stepmother, teacher, protector. Elizabeth, especially, would never forget her influence, the calm strength of the woman who survived where others perished. And when Henry died, Catherine did not fade into shadow. She lived on, free at last from the danger of his love. She married again, this time for passion, to Thomas Seymour, brother of Jane Seymour. It was a union of desire, perhaps folly, but it was her choice, not the king's. For Catherine Parr was the queen who learned the deadliest lesson of Henry's court. Survival was not won by beauty, nor by defiance, but by wisdom. She bent when others stood rigid, she soothed when others sparked rage, she lived when others died. In the end, her story is not one of a tragic downfall, but of victory. Quiet, cautious, but victory nonetheless. And yet, even her survival casts shadows. For her final love, her marriage to Thomas Seymour, will bring peril not to herself alone, but to another, the young Princess Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, who will one day inherit the throne. For Seymour's ambition is boundless, his charm dangerous, and Elizabeth, bright, vulnerable, untested, will find herself caught in his snares. The tale of Catherine Parr's secret heart, and of Seymour's fatal ambition, waits just beyond the closing of this chamber's door. The great weight of Henry's presence finally lifted in January of 1547. The king who had consumed 6 wives, who had remade a kingdom in his image, who had struck down friend and foe alike with equal cruelty, was gone. His swollen body, ravaged by disease, was lowered into the vault at Windsor beside Jane Seymour, the only wife he had chosen to honor in death. And Catherine Parr, for the first time in her life, was free. She had worn the crown with caution, played the role of nurse and diplomat, soothed the king's temper, and bent her sharp mind to survival. She had lived where others had died. But Catherine was still a woman of flesh and longing, and her heart, quiet, patient, restrained during Henry's reign, still beat with desire. In those first months of widowhood, when the court was hushed with mourning and the new boy King Edward VI was guided by his counsel, Catherine's thoughts returned to a man she had once loved before Henry had claimed her. His name was Thomas Seymour. Thomas, the brother of Jane Seymour, uncle to the young king, uncle too to Edward's half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth. He was handsome, daring, reckless. Where Henry had been a mountain, immovable and consuming, Thomas was fire, charming, ambitious, dangerous in his allure. Catherine had admired him once, perhaps even hoped to marry him, but Henry's proposal had crushed that dream. Queens do not choose their hearts. They obey their crowns. Now, with Henry gone, Catherine reached for what had been denied her. Within months, she and Thomas were wed in secret. It was a hasty union, shocking in its speed, for queens dowager were expected to wait, to observe propriety. But Catherine was no longer cautious. For once in her life, she allowed her heart to rule her head. Their marriage was passionate, perhaps reckless, but filled with warmth. Catherine, long starved of love, finally found intimacy. She laughed again, she played music, she welcomed scholars into her household. Her house at Chelsea became a center of learning, where young Elizabeth Tudor, Henry's daughter by Anne Boleyn, resided for a time. Catherine, ever the stepmother, guided Elizabeth with care, teaching her languages, encouraging her sharp intellect, nurturing in her the seeds of the queen she would one day become. But shadows lingered even in this brief happiness. For Thomas Seymour was not content with Catherine's love alone. Ambition gnawed at him. His brother Edward Seymour, now Duke of Somerset, served as Lord Protector of the realm, ruling England in the name of young King Edward VI. Thomas, restless and envious, chafed at his brother's authority. He sought power of his own, schemed for influence. And in the reckless pursuit of it, he cast his gaze too boldly upon the young Elizabeth. Catherine, at first, may not have seen the danger. Thomas was playful by nature, given to flirtation. He teased Elizabeth, tickled her in the gardens, stole into her chamber at dawn. The princess was only 14, clever beyond her years but still vulnerable, still learning the peril of men's desire. The great weight of Henry's presence finally lifted in January of 1547. The king who had consumed 6 wives, who had remade a kingdom in his image, who had struck down friend and foe alike with equal cruelty, was gone. His swollen body, ravaged by disease, was lowered into the vault at Windsor beside Jane Seymour, the only wife he had chosen to honor in death. And Catherine Parr, for the first time in her life, was free. She had worn the crown with caution, played the role of nurse and diplomat, soothed the king's temper, and bent her sharp mind to survival. She had lived where others had died. But Catherine was still a woman of flesh and longing, and her heart, quiet, patient, restrained during Henry's reign, still beat with desire. In those first months of widowhood, when the court was hushed with mourning and the new boy King Edward VI was guided by his counsel, Catherine's thoughts returned to a man she had once loved before Henry had claimed her. His name was Thomas Seymour. Thomas, the brother of Jane Seymour, uncle to the young king, uncle too to Edward's half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth. He was handsome, daring, reckless. Where Henry had been a mountain, immovable and consuming, Thomas was fire, charming, ambitious, dangerous in his allure. Catherine had admired him once, perhaps even hoped to marry him, but Henry's proposal had crushed that dream. Queens do not choose their hearts. They obey their crowns. Now, with Henry gone, Catherine reached for what had been denied her. Within months, she and Thomas were wed in secret. It was a hasty union, shocking in its speed, for queens dowager were expected to wait, to observe propriety. But Catherine was no longer cautious. For once in her life, she allowed her heart to rule her head. Their marriage was passionate, perhaps reckless, but filled with warmth. Catherine, long starved of love, finally found intimacy. She laughed again, she played music, she welcomed scholars into her household. Her house at Chelsea became a centre of learning, where young Elizabeth Tudor, Henry's daughter by Anne Boleyn, resided for a time. Catherine, ever the stepmother, guided Elizabeth with care, teaching her languages, encouraging her sharp intellect, nurturing in her the seeds of the queen she would one day become. But shadows lingered even in this brief happiness. For Thomas Seymour was not content with Catherine's love alone. Ambition gnawed at him. His brother Edward Seymour, now Duke of Somerset, served as Lord Protector of the realm, ruling England in the name of young King Edward VI. Thomas, restless and envious, chafed at his brother's authority. He sought power of his own, schemed for influence. And in the reckless pursuit of it, he cast his gaze too boldly upon the young Elizabeth. Catherine, at first, may not have seen the danger. Thomas was playful by nature, given to flirtation. He teased Elizabeth, tickled her in the gardens, stole into her chamber at dawn. The princess was only 14, clever beyond her years but still vulnerable, still learning the peril of men's desires. Catherine laughed at first, even joining in once or twice, treating it as harmless sport. But soon, she saw the shadows behind the game. Thomas lingered too long. Elizabeth blushed too deeply. Whispers began to stir. The tension grew until one morning Catherine entered Elizabeth's chamber to find Thomas with his arms around the princess. The scene was ambiguous, innocent enough to deny, damning enough to destroy. Catherine's composure cracked. Whether out of jealousy, fear, or sudden clarity, she sent Elizabeth away from her household, dismissing her to guard both the girl's honor and her own marriage. The shadow of Catherine Parr's death still lingers at Sudeley Castle. Her voice, once steady and wise, is silenced, her body laid to rest in alabaster calm. The household mourns, the courtiers whisper, and the infant daughter she bore fades into history's silence. But Catherine's passing does not end the story. It opens the door for ambition unchained. For the man she loved, Thomas Seymour, is left untethered, and his restless hunger now turns toward the most dangerous prey of all, the young Elizabeth Tudor. Elizabeth is just 14 when she leaves Catherine's household, dismissed after the Queen discovered her husband's reckless playfulness with the princess had gone too far. She is clever, striking, with her mother and Boleyn's dark eyes and sharp wit, and her father Henry's fiery temper tempered by watchful caution. She is, even then, extraordinary. And she has learned early that survival in the Tudor court means balance, never too bold, never too submissive, always alert. But Thomas Seymour is not a man who respects balance. Handsome, charismatic, reckless, he is a man who thrives on risk. His brother, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, rules as Lord Protector during the boy King Edward VI's minority. Thomas resents him, jealous of his authority, hungry for power. He has charm, yes, but charm is not enough for him. He wants influence, he wants wealth, and perhaps most dangerously, he wants Elizabeth. In Catherine Parr's household, his behavior had been brushed aside as flirtation, tickling Elizabeth in the gardens, slipping into her chamber in the mornings, embracing her too warmly, whispering words that carried more weight than mere jest. Catherine had laughed at first, then grown alarmed, and finally sent Elizabeth away. But Catherine is gone now. No shield remains between Elizabeth and Seymour's ambition. Elizabeth withdraws to Cheshunt and then to Hatfield, her own small households. She studies languages, philosophy, history. She writes letters to her guardians with sharp wit, already displaying the mind of a ruler. But Seymour circles still. He sends her gifts, exchanges letters, keeps his name in her ear. Some whisper he dreams of marrying her, that he sees in her not only beauty but the crown itself. For Elizabeth, though still a girl, is second in line to the throne after her sister Mary. To wed her would be to claim unimaginable power. Imagine Elizabeth in those days, young, brilliant, ambitious, yet vulnerable. She knows the stories of her mother Anne's fall, of Catherine Howard's betrayal, of Catherine Parr's careful survival. She has seen how love is poison in Henry's court, how a woman's heart can be used against her. And yet Thomas Seymour's charm is not easily dismissed. Perhaps she felt flattered, perhaps she even allowed herself to dream. But Elizabeth was her mother's daughter, and she learned quickly to mask her true thoughts behind a veil of caution. Seymour, meanwhile, grows bolder. He schemes against his brother Somerset, conspiring with courtiers to seize greater power. He talks of marrying Elizabeth, and when whispers reach the council, alarm spreads. To marry a princess without the realm's consent would be treason. To compromise her honor would be disaster. And Seymour's recklessness, his inability to curb his appetite, finally brings him down. In 1549, his schemes against Somerset collapse. He is accused of plotting to kidnap the young King Edward VI, to control his person and thus the throne itself. The charges are damning. Treason is declared. Seymour is arrested, dragged to the Tower, the same grim fortress where Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, Jane Rochford, and so many others had perished. Elizabeth, too, is questioned. Imagine her there, barely 15, summoned before stern-faced counselors, grilled about her relationship with Seymour. Did he touch her? Did he promise marriage? Did she love him? The girl who would be queen one day sits straight-backed, her dark eyes flashing with intelligence. She answers carefully, never too much, never too little. She denies impropriety, insists she is innocent, turns aside every trap laid for her. Even then, Elizabeth shows the steel that will define her reign. She will not be broken. The counselors press harder, bringing forward servants who testify about Seymour's dawn visits, his embraces, the whispers in the gardens. Elizabeth holds firm. "I will not open windows into men's souls," she says, words that foreshadow the cautious distance she will one day keep in matters of faith and love alike. She escapes condemnation, but the experience leaves a scar. She has seen how close she came to ruin, how her honor, her very life, balanced on the edge of a man's ambition. Thomas Seymour, less cautious, meets his end. In March of 1549, he is executed on Tower Hill. He dies unrepentant, his charm undimmed, though history remembers him as reckless, foolish, consumed by a hunger he could not control. Elizabeth, meanwhile, survives. She emerges from the scandal chastened but stronger. She has learned a lesson she will never forget. Love is peril, desire is a trap, marriage is a gamble too deadly for a woman with a crown in her destiny. From this crucible, the myth of the Virgin Queen begins to form, not from purity alone, but from the knowledge that in a world of men's betrayals, her heart must remain her own. And so, from the ashes of Seymour's ambition, Elizabeth begins to rise. No longer merely the daughter of Anne Boleyn, no longer the vulnerable princess under suspicion, but the woman who will one day stand alone, wielding power as England's queen. The scandal of Seymour fades into whispers, but Elizabeth carries its shadow with her all her life. She has seen the cost of misplaced trust. She has felt the brush of ruin. And she will never let herself be caught so close to destruction again. From here, our path carries us toward the final chamber of this story, the moment when Elizabeth steps fully into her inheritance. Not as the bride of a man, not as the pawn of ambition, but as the Virgin Queen, wielding her solitude as a weapon, her crown as her armor, and her past as the fire that steels her. The shadow of the scaffold hangs long over Elizabeth Tudor's childhood. She has seen her mother's head fall, though she was too young to remember it. She has walked in the echo of Catherine Howard's terror, heard the whispers of Catherine Parr's caution, felt the dangerous warmth of Thomas Seymour's ambition. Each of Henry's wives has left her a lesson carved into her bones: do not yield, do not trust, do not mistake a crown for love. By the time she ascends the throne in 1558, Elizabeth is no longer the frightened girl questioned over Seymour's advances, nor the overlooked daughter of a disgraced queen. She is 25, sharp-eyed, wary, determined. The crown weighs heavy upon her brow, not only with the burden of rule but with the memories of those who wore it before her. Catherine of Aragon's pride, Anne Boleyn's passion, Jane Seymour's sacrifice, and of Clevy's survival, Catherine Howard's folly, Catherine Parr's wit, all these ghosts walk with Elizabeth as she steps into power. The court she inherits is restless, divided. The shadow of her sister Mary's reign lingers: burnings, executions, the marriage to Spain that left the realm uneasy. Elizabeth knows she must tread carefully. She cannot be her father, sweeping aside opposition with sheer will. She cannot be her mother, destroyed by passion and ambition. She cannot be her sister, consumed by devotion and vengeance. She must be something new, something England has never seen before. And so she crafts herself into a legend. Do you see her first coronation procession? The January air crisp, the streets of London thronged with people, their faces eager, uncertain, hopeful. Elizabeth rides through them, her gown shimmering with white and gold, her hair loose around her shoulders like a maiden, her eyes alive with intelligence. She reaches out to touch the hands of her subjects, smiling, speaking with them as though she were one of their own. The crowd roars with approval, their joy washing over her. From the beginning, she understands the art of theater, of spectacle, of ruling hearts as well as laws. But she also understands the dangers. Every suitor who approaches her is a dagger in disguise. Spain presses her to wed a Habsburg. France dangles princes before her. Even her own courtiers dream of the crown through her hand. Yet Elizabeth hesitates. She stalls, she flatters, she deflects. For she knows what marriage means. She has seen it destroy queens. She has seen it turn crowns into shackles. She will not be bound. Her counselors fret. Your Majesty must marry, they insist. England needs an heir. But Elizabeth only smiles, her voice velvet over steel. I am already bound to a husband, she tells them, the kingdom of England. And so is born the myth of the Virgin Queen. Not untouched, not untempted, for rumors swirl always about her closeness with Robert Dudley, her childhood friend turned favorite, the man whose wife's suspicious death sparked scandal. But Elizabeth never crosses the line that would ruin her. She allows the whispers, she uses the tension, but she keeps her crown inviolate. She is both woman and monarch, balancing them with exquisite care. When Parliament presses her to wed, she flares with her father's temper. When ambassadors pry into her heart, she deflects with her mother's wit. When rivals threaten, she shows her stepmother Catherine Parr's intelligence, playing factions against each other, always keeping herself just beyond their grasp. Her reign is not without scandal. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, her cousin, her rival, shocks Europe. Elizabeth hesitates for years, reluctant to kill an anointed queen, haunted by the memory of her mother's fall. But plots to replace her multiply, and at last the warrant is signed. Mary walks to the scaffold at Fotheringhay in 1587, her last words a prayer in Latin, her head falling with dignity. Elizabeth weeps at the news, perhaps sincerely, perhaps for show. But she has done what her father did before her, sacrificed blood to secure her throne. Yet it is not blood alone that defines her. It is fire. The Spanish Armada comes in 1588, Philip II sending his mightiest fleet to crush the Protestant queen. Elizabeth rides among her troops at Tilbury, clad in armor, her hair gleaming, her voice carrying across the ranks. I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, she declares, but I have the heart and stomach of a king. The words ignite her soldiers, and when storms and English fire ships scatter the armada, Elizabeth's legend grows larger still. Through it all, she remains solitary. Lovers may circle, suitors may plead, but she does not marry. She has learned too much of men's betrayals, too much of women's downfalls. Instead, she turns her solitude into strength, crafting an image of purity and power, the virgin queen whose only marriage is to her people. Her court glitters with poets and adventurers. Shakespeare writes his plays beneath her reign. Raleigh and Drake sail to the edges of the world. Music fills the halls, masks dazzle, diplomacy twists like a dance. Yet beneath it all lies Elizabeth's watchful eye, her caution, her refusal to let passion undo her. She laughs, she scolds, she charms, but she never yields. As she grows older, the legend hardens. Her face, once youthful, becomes painted with heavy layers of white, her hair adorned with jewels and pearls. She is no longer a maiden, but she plays the role still, her image larger than life. She becomes a living myth, untouchable, radiant, both adored and feared. And yet, in her solitude, there must have been nights when the mask slipped. When she thought of Robert Dudley, of the children she never bore, of the family torn apart by Henry's cruelty. Perhaps she remembered Catherine of Aragon's dignity, and Boleyn's fire, Jane Seymour's sacrifice, and of Clevy's quiet survival, Catherine Howard's terror, Catherine Parr's wisdom. Perhaps she saw in herself the culmination of all their stories, the daughter who had learned from their blood how to endure. When Elizabeth dies in 1603, after 45 years on the throne, England weeps and trembles. She leaves no heir, no son to carry her name. But she leaves a kingdom transformed, Protestant, proud, feared across Europe, rich in culture and discovery. She leaves a legend so vast that centuries later her name still conjures power. And as she lies in Westminster, beside her sister Mary, her motto seems carved into the very stone of the realm, Semper Idem, always the same. She had been constant where others faltered, cunning where others fell, solitary where others were ensnared. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, the Queen of scandal and power, the last of the Tudors, remains, even in death, untouchable. And so the long corridor of Henry's wives and children ends here, in the solitary figure of a daughter who turned blood into strength, betrayal into wisdom, and solitude into a crown. The flicker of torches in the Tudor halls has gone out, the rustle of silk has faded, the metallic chill of the axe has grown cold. Only silence remains, filled with echoes of queens who lived, loved, and perished under the shadow of one man's throne. But in that silence, one voice endures, the voice of Elizabeth, whispering still across the centuries, the last and greatest survivor of them all.